Good afternoon and welcome to this news event hosted by Friends of the Earth and the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, or NIRS for short. You'll be hearing from 4 speakers today, and then we'll open the floor for questions during the Q&A period. The Q&A period will be for reporters only, and if you wish to ask a question, please use the raise your hand function, and your line will be unmuted when it is your turn to ask a question. For more information and to follow along to today's news event, you can visit the Friends of the Earth website. That's foe.org. That's where you can find the news release and link to the report. I'll also be dropping a direct link to the report into the chat box here shortly. As I mentioned, you'll be hearing from 4 speakers today. Our first speaker today will be Tim Judson, Executive Director of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, or NIRS for short. Our second speaker today will be Dr. Mark Cooper. He's the Senior Research Fellow for Economic Analysis at the Institute for Energy and the Environment at the Vermont Law School and author of today's report. Our third speaker today will be David Kraft, Director of the Nuclear Energy Information Service in Chicago. And our fourth speaker today will be Lucas Ross, Program Manager at Friends of the Earth. But let's begin with our first speaker today. That is Tim Judson, Executive Director of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service. Tim?
Thanks, Alex. Hello to all of the journalists and representatives of the news media. Thank you for joining us today for the release of Dr. Mark Cooper's new report. I'm going to offer some brief introductory remarks and then introduce Dr. Cooper to discuss the report, and he'll be followed by our 2 other presenters, David Kraft of NEIS and Lucas Ross of Friends of the Earth. My name is Tim Judson, and I'm Executive Director of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, or NIRS. Together with Friends of the Earth, we commissioned Dr. Cooper to produce this report because of the debate now happening in Washington about a national infrastructure plan to promote a just and equitable economic growth, decarbonize our energy supply, and address the impacts of climate change. Since 2014, there has been an intensifying debate over the role nuclear power can, will, or must, or not have in reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and responding to the climate crisis. It is played out at the state and federal level through a series of proposals for large subsidies, usually through the short-term lens of a corporate decision to hire 1 or more nuclear power plants. In this time, 5 states have enacted the kind of subsidies for aging reactors that are now being proposed at the federal level through proposals that could total up to $50 billion over the next 10 years. Dr. Cooper's report addresses the effectiveness and impacts of these policies, particularly in light of President Biden's goals for the American Jobs Plan, to promote a just, equitable, thriving economic recovery and to build a national response to climate change. Dr. Cooper is clearly the most qualified person to conduct such an analysis. He has appeared more than 300 times before public utility commissions, federal agencies, and state and federal legislatures in more than 40 jurisdictions in the US and Canada. Over the last decade or so, he has produced a series of reports analyzing the economics of nuclear power and the transition to a clean energy system in all of its aspects. He's the author of The Political Economy of Electricity, Progressive Capitalism, and the Struggle to Build a Sustainable Electric Power Sector, and Power Shift, the Deployment of a 21st Century Electricity Sector and the Nuclear War to Stop It. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mark Cooper to present the results of his report.
Thanks. Again, that was Tim Judson, the Executive Director of NIRS. And that takes us to our next speaker, as Tim mentioned, that is Dr. Mark Cooper. Dr. Cooper, please begin.
All right, thank you. I think you can all hear me now. The technological revolution of the last quarter century has created a solution to the dilemma of pursuing decarbonization and development. Onshore wind and utility photovoltaics on the supply side, to demand-side resources, efficiency, and intelligence, which I mean active management of supply and demand utilizing digital communications, computational capacity, and advanced control technologies, are now low enough so that we can actually have decarbonization and increasing electricity consumption, which is key to decarbonizing the global economy. Now, these resources are least cost by a mile in the long term, and they are quite cost competitive in the short term. So there's no conflict anymore between the short-term cost and the long-term cost. They increase macroeconomic growth, and generate more dispersed jobs than central station facilities. So with all this going for the transformation and the alternatives, you might wonder, why do we need policy? And there are a couple of reasons for that. First, the need for speed is great. Alternatives will not be deployed fast enough to meet the current goal for decarbonization. Second, the rules that have been put in place over the past century favor the central station approaches and are hostile to alternatives. And of course, the powerful interests vested in the 20th century system will resist and frustrate change, and that threatens to reduce the possibilities for the alternatives. The second question that you frequently hear is, well, why don't we just build a bunch of nuclear reactors? Simply put, they cost too much, take too long, and raise environmental and public health concerns of their own. Old reactors still cost 2 to 3 times as much as alternatives, and that's what the subsidies are all about. They're uneconomic. New reactors are 3 to 5 times as expensive as alternatives. And they simply will not get there here in large numbers until well into the next decade, even longer. And by then, we've been told the battle will be lost. And let's be clear, nuclear power has made almost no contribution to the reduction in carbon in the United States in the past 20 years. The entire decarbonization that has taken place has been the renewables. Over the past 70 years, nuclear power has been the recipient of massive subsidies, but has failed to deliver on its central promise to yield low-cost power. The magnitude of their subsidies dwarfs the subsidies that have been enjoyed by renewables. And the current system also bestows special treatment on these facilities. It socializes risk and waste management and system costs, which are frequently recovered from the alternatives rather than the ratepayers. The tax treatment is friendly. The capacity reserves are friendly. The high burdens that they place on the system by large reserve margin requirements, the must-run inflexible status that they insist on, all of those are special advantages that they currently get. Renewable technologies have delivered on their promise because they embody the opportunity to do some research and development and deployment to learn how to do things. That's something that the nuclear industry has never done, is not doing, and almost certainly will never do. So that renewables are deployed at small scale by numerous people in competitive markets. That has not been the case with nuclear power. So that in spite of 70 years of economic failure, more likely because of it, nuclear advocates have returned to a favorite strategy. They insist that they are indispensable and hype a new technology. Nuclear power would like to squeeze into the mix in the beginning to solve a niche problem, and at the end to solve a niche problem. But both claims are false. In the beginning, they threatened to undermine reliability by retiring many reactors. But rules to keep necessary reactors online are already in place at every ISO and every RTO. And they're on the books. If they threaten to leave, they have to give warning, they have to give time, and they have to allow people to adjust to their absence. If more is needed, a very small program like the Biden proposal, which demands that reactors prove that they are needed both in terms of cost and in terms of carbon. It has a tight cap, which creates competition for a subsidy. The subsidy is quite small. So if we need anything, and I'm not saying we do, that would be the way to go. At the end of the process, they claim that you can't get to 100% decarbonization without nuclear. Unfortunately, they really don't want to live under the rules that would be necessary to get us close to 100%. I'll take close, and then we can debate what we need. But they hate those rules. They don't like the flexibility. Small modular reactors say they can, but they would have a very hard time recovering their costs on the small orders, the small numbers of orders that they're getting, and their orders are shrinking. So they lose economies of scale. And they also would have a lower load factor, which would make it very difficult to recover capital costs. Now, they say they'll do other things to non-grid related things to offset those capital costs. But the problem there is that the renewables will do exactly the same thing at less than half the price. There's no way that they will be able to compete for those functions in the marketplace. In short, there is no need to support nuclear power with subsidies at either the beginning or the end of the transformation. The electricity sector will, in fact, be a leading edge for decarbonization. We certainly don't need them in the middle. The goal here is to achieve, with a progressive and market-oriented approach, the kind of basis for creating an American century. That's what the 20th century was called, because of the pragmatic, progressive capitalism we pursued throughout that century. And that's in the subtitle of my book, and it's really important. We can lay the basis for the 21st century in the electricity sector and the transportation sector and the rest of the economy by pursuing renewables, alternatives up to 100% decarbonization. Thank you.
Again, that was Dr. Mark Cooper, Senior Research Fellow for Economic Analysis at the Institute for Energy and the Environment at Vermont Law School and author of today's report. That takes us to our third speaker today, which is David Kraft, Director of the Nuclear Energy Information Service in Chicago. David, please begin.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Dr. Cooper, for writing this report. I've been asked to make some real-world remarks about the effects of nuclear bailouts, and our experience here in Illinois has been that these effects have been corrosive. Nuclear bailouts represent the government's way of turning people into utility ATM machines. At the state level, let it be the ratepayers. At the federal level, let it be the taxpayers. Because it's always easier to spend somebody else's money, especially when you're trying to score political points with voters and donors. Nowhere is this more in evidence than in the states of Illinois, our home state, and Ohio, characterized by not only outrageous nuclear bailouts imposed on ratepayers, but also horrendous amounts of political corruption, essential and intrinsic to sealing the bailout deals. In Illinois, the 2016 Future Energy Jobs Act, it's also known as FEJA, lavished $2.35 billion over a 10-year period to rescue 3 allegedly unprofitable Exelon nuclear reactors from threatened closure, implementing the now legendary, quote, nuclear hostage crisis method, unquote. This method of legalized extortion consists of a nuclear utility, in this case Exelon, crying nuclear plants are unprofitable without opening their books for independent verification, of course, and threatening to close them down. In the next phase, the plant workers and their families and the local tax base entities dependent on the plant operation put pressure on local state legislators to do something. In the 2016 case, that was bail out 3 reactors. This bailout gambit has become so successfully lucrative that it has actually been suggested as a valid component of a nuclear utility's business model, at least according to environmental regulator turned lobbyist Michael Krancer in his PowerPoint presentation at a 2017 utility conference. In both the Ohio and Illinois cases, these bailouts represented renewables that weren't, meaning they either did not use those billions to construct new renewables, efficiency, energy storage, or improved transmission, or in Ohio's case, overt efforts were also enacted to restrict such renewables expansion. For example, the $2.35 billion 2016 Illinois nuclear bailout represents the approximate financial equivalence of 1,175 brand new 2-megawatt wind turbines in today's dollars, the statewide construction and distribution of which would have produced local construction and operation jobs and a broader distribution of tax benefits to a wider population. Not to mention the potential for land leasing fees paid to farmers on whose land the turbines would have been built. As the old saying goes, Stupidity and evil are the same, judging by the results. But the power in nuclear power means more than electrons. Thanks to the FBI, corrupt lobbying practices by Exelon's subsidiary ComEd in Illinois were identified that while possibly resulting in that 2016 $2.35 billion bailout, it also resulted in a guilty plea and a $200 million fine on corruption charges. It also resulted in indictments of former lobbyists and the indictment and early retirements of several top ComEd and Exelon officers. Ultimately, it also cost State Representative Michael Madigan his 50-year-plus job as the Speaker of the Illinois House and as a state legislative kingpin, as well as resulting in his resignation from the legislature, with the cloud of a possible future FBI indictment currently hanging over his head as well. Currently, in 2021 in Illinois, critically important energy legislation that would have aggressively expanded renewables, efficiency, and just transitions programs for communities, as well as environmental justice programs, adversely affected by fossil fuel and nuclear plant closures, was stymied in part over the dispute over a newly requested Exelon bailout of as much as $500+ million per year for anywhere from 9 to 15 years. That was the Exelon proposal. This time, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker refused to play along with the nuclear hostage crisis scenario and ordered an independent audit of Exelon's books, an audit which revealed that at most, Exelon's allegedly troubled reactors should receive no more than $350 million in bailout money for no more than 5 years, and possibly less if energy prices improved. Unfortunately, the nuclear power of local politics expanded that proposed amount to $700 million for 5 years. But the energy legislation fell apart, and this bailout was not enacted. All of this reveals that bailouts inhibit the expansion of renewable energy, and that the correlation and causation meet over the political corruption required to make bailouts happen. Perhaps the next FBI bailout corruption investigations should look a little higher up the political chain into the federal arena. All of this leads to the inescapable conclusion that you can't build an energy future by bailing out the past. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, that was David Kraft, Director of the Nuclear Energy Information Service in Chicago. And that takes us to our fourth and final speaker today. That is Lucas Ross, Program Manager at Friends of the Earth. Lucas, please begin.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the federal politics, and in particular, some of the specific proposals that are in play for this coming summer's infrastructure package. So just to set the stage a little bit, bailout plans like Senator Cardin's are bad for taxpayers, bad for consumers, and bad for the climate. The price tag on this proposal would be $50 billion over the coming decade, as documented in Dr. Cooper's report. Now, we've already heard from Mark and Tim and David about the losing economics of these proposals. I think that the thing that I would like to underline here today is that the bailout schemes under consideration this summer are a direct threat to President Biden's entire domestic agenda. Let me explain why. The tax parts of the infrastructure process are happening through the very arcane process of budget reconciliation, which through one form or another, anyone who is looking at infrastructure issues this summer has had to become at least something of an expert on. And just to underline it substantially, the reality of reconciliation is the reality of scarcity. The more money funneled to existing nuclear, the less money available for urgent and popular policies like the child tax credit, like the Medicaid expansion, like wind and solar. When it comes to the art of the shakedown, the nuclear industry is absolutely unrivaled. What we are witnessing now is the same strategy. What we are witnessing now is something that we have seen before. The same strategy of nuclear bailout blackmail pioneered in states like New York, Illinois, and Connecticut is now playing out on a national stage. The infrastructure package taking shape this summer could be the nuclear industry's biggest heist yet. Just to burrow into the carbon proposal a little bit, this is a proposed production tax credit for existing reactors that would be worth roughly $15 per megawatt hour. So in English, what that translates to is this. This is essentially a proposal to spend $50 billion to pay for electricity twice. Once now with major new subsidies, and again when these units retire and need to be replaced with new capacity. This is a bad investment that at immense cost would distribute benefits very narrowly to a handful of utilities at the expense of renewables and ratepayers. So I think that we're just sort of in the shadow now of one of the most important policy developments of the last year, which is the dam breaking 2 nights ago and Democrats putting a number on the overall size of the reconciliation package. And this is what I mean by the reality of scarcity. Democrats have already put a number on the maximum size of all the policy measures not being shoehorned into the bipartisan process. And as of 2 nights ago, that number was 3.5 trillion. Now, I think that between here and Manchin, that number could shrink. But the reality is that the amount of money available is capped now. And there are a lot of policy priorities that are very much in need and very popular that need to fit within that 3.5 trillion. The Medicare expansion, the child tax credit, the entirety of Senator Wyden's Clean Energy for America Act, which includes new subsidies for wind and solar. Now, I think that the main thing to keep in mind here is that what we have with proposals like the carbon tax credit is bad policy leading to bad politics. The proposal is effectively sucking money away from the most popular pieces of President Biden's agenda. And that popularity is going to be absolutely necessary to carry any piece of major legislation across the finish line. And I just want to emphasize here by sort of, clarifying the state of play on some of these infrastructure issues. There is the Cardin bill, which costs $50 billion, which the nuclear industry wants to see added to Senator Wyden's clean energy tax credit bill, but which has not been added yet. And then there is a provision much smaller in the current Manchin infrastructure bill, which is moving separately as part of the bipartisan process. This would allocate $6 billion for existing reactors in merchant markets. Let me be absolutely clear here. The Cardin bill is a flamethrower. The Manchin bill is a blowtorch. Both can do plenty of damage to renewables and ratepayers. Neither belongs in serious climate legislation. And with that, I think I'll pass it back and we'll get started on the questions.
Thank you. Again, that was Lucas Ross, Program Manager at Friends of the Earth. And that takes us to the Q&A portion of the event. If you wish to ask a question, use the raise your hand function and your line will be unmuted when it is your turn to ask a question. As a reminder, the Q&A period is for reporters only. If you are having issues with your own audio or the raise your hand function, you may use the text-based Q&A box and we'll do our best to get to all the questions. But before we begin with questions, I want to mention that a video recording of this news event will be made available online later today at the Friends of the Earth website. That along with other media materials. That website is foe.org. All right. Let's see if we have any questions at the moment. We do have questions offline. Questions from Bloomberg. In terms of the subsidies that are in play, are all the subsidy proposals for nuclear for existing reactors, or do they cover new nuclear as well?
I can speak to that. Yeah, so what we're talking about here with the Manchin and Cardin proposals is merchant reactors in deregulated markets. Separately, there are existing subsidies for new capacity. in theory, the Wyden tax credit bill, which is a technology neutral approach to to refundable tax credits and emissions reductions, theoretically it would qualify new reactors, but I think like in the neighborhood of the same rate of the advanced nuclear tax credit that's been on the books for quite a while now, and which hasn't moved the needle substantially in terms of building advanced capacity. I think that broadly speaking, the threat here is the lifeline to the merchant fleet. But I welcome input from my other panelists.
This is Mark Cooper. Let me emphasize one thing. The important thing is that if you offered a subsidy on a technology neutral, product neutral basis, that is, if you required everyone to compete for the subsidy, which, as I point out, there are certain aspects of some of the proposals, then nuclear will lose. They need a pure subsidy directed to them. They will not bid for the right to access that subsidy. So the best protection we have, ultimately against all of these things, is a simple market test. The guy who comes in and asks for the smallest subsidy wins. And nuclear is always asking for the biggest subsidy or a dedicated subsidy.
All right, let's take our next question. Our next question comes from Nuclear Intelligence Weekly. This question is for Mark. Can you comment on methodologies used to determine reactor operating costs, risk, and losses, like the Synapse report in Illinois, and particularly as it pertains to the DOE's administration of Manchin's proposed nuclear credit program?
Well, yes, I look at great length at the Synapse report because it basically concluded that the magnitude of the subsidy that, it was only one reactor. Well, it's two reactors, one for a short period of time, very small sum of money, one for a reasonably short period of time and small sum of money. So if you get a chance to look at the reactors, what Synapse found was that all but one are now making money. That is, in the true sense of capitalism, as long as the market is covering your operating costs and making some contribution to your fixed costs, you are, quote, making money. The utilities are not making as much as they would like, but Synapse made it clear that they are making money and that the only one that really needed it was a small subsidy for a short period of time, and it would be making money on its own. So that is really important about the market test. It's important about the Biden proposal, which forces the operator to prove that they need the money. And if they come in and say, I need a full rate of return in order to operate this plant, well, that's not the way capitalism works. When you've got a bad asset, you don't get a full return. You expect to get less. You may hope for the market to catch up, et cetera. So that is extremely important. The methodology is based upon, we did Synapse for that aspect. I've also personally been involved in the New York bailout. But the data on which I base my cost projections is all Lazard. I compare it to EIA. So this is all well-published data that leads to the conclusion that nuclear power is simply uneconomic, and any effort to support it is not necessary. I devote a chapter to this question: is can we get there with renewables? And the answer is unequivocally yes. That was true several years ago, and it's absolutely true today, that we can get to 100% quickly. Exactly how quickly remains to be seen, but we have to start down that path of 100%. And this is exactly the wrong thing to do at the beginning.
Thank you, Mark. Let's take our next question. That is from Earth Stories Media. In addition to the financial opportunity costs, could you address the climate opportunity costs, past and future, of the state and federal policies addressed today?
Well, again, I look at Lazard's estimate of the value of carbon abatement, which is I always use Lazard. I used him from day one. It's 13 years ago. He's very sensitive to all of these issues. The value of abatement in with renewables is much higher because they cost less, and the old reactors disappear in the midterm. Their costs are way too high. Several new resources, renewable resources, onshore wind, community solar, commercial and industrial rooftop solar, even residential rooftop. In the long term, they become very attractive for carbon abatement. So there's a simple rule I think we need to apply. If you pay too much for something, like carbon, you will not buy as much as you otherwise would have. The least cost way to approach it is to start with the wind and solar efficiency and intelligence, have that carry us as far as we can, and that will carry us an awfully long way. And by the time we get to the point where we might be running out of attractive sites, the other technologies will take over. So in the long term, there's a massive savings to be had compared to nuclear, compared to carbon capture and storage. That's the second one Lazard looked at, I looked at, and the answer is that the alternative system is by far the least cost system for reducing carbon and also producing electricity.
Yeah, and I'll just add that there's I mean, we have evidence for how this plays out, through what's been happening at the state level the last several years. And one very clear example is what's happened in New York, where there are 4 nuclear reactors that are receiving a total of $7.6 billion in subsidies over a 12-year period. And when that policy was being developed or promulgated, there was actually a study produced by advocates for an energy efficiency standard in New York, as something to be considered in a broader energy policy. And what they found was that over that same 12-year period, an energy efficiency standard would have actually led to reductions in electricity demand equivalent to what the nuclear power plants generated, but at a net cost savings to consumers of $3 billion. And so in creating the nuclear subsidy instead of an energy efficiency standard, the New York Public Service Commission made the choice to essentially allocate $10 billion more in costs to consumers over this 12-year period, which means that not only was there not a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but also that New York has $10 billion less money to spend on other solutions to the climate crisis and other important programs. And so this really is an opportunity cost to spend money subsidizing old nuclear power plants rather than investing in the resources that Dr. Cooper analyzes in this report.
All right, let's take our next question from Physics Today. That is, to what extent do your cost comparisons on renewables and nuclear include energy storage to accommodate their intermittency? DOE earlier this week announced a plan to reduce energy storage costs by 90% by 2030. Regardless of whether that's attainable, doesn't that indicate that storage costs today are way too high?
Well, storage costs have been coming down. If you look at lithium-ion batteries and the utilities who have now become very enamored of what I call the hybrid solar model, which I look at in the report, which is actually also analyzed in the EIA. They use the term hybrid and they explain why. Well, it's almost base load, but it's not quite base load, so that's why they create this term hybrid. It's a least cost solution. It's much lower cost than carbon capture and storage in fossil fuels or nuclear. So yes, storage is important. Storage has never been studied. Storage has not been the object of capitalist interest in the past because the old system just wasn't interested in it. They stored it in peakers. And so the decline of storage costs is important. At the end of the day, that will fill a large part of what is needed. But let's be clear, we don't need an awful lot of storage till we get to 30 or 50 or 60%. The California study, the utilities in California were asked, well, what's the impact of renewables? And they found until 1/3, which the U.S. is, 1/10 at most, until 1/3 is renewable, you don't really have a problem. It's easy. There's least cost solutions. So yes, eventually storage will become very important, even more important today, and eventually it will become very low cost because capitalism is working on lowering storage costs.
All right, let's take our next question. It's a follow-up question from Earth Stories Media. The question is, David Kraft outlined the influence peddling and corruption issues involved in state bailouts. Could he and your national policy panelists address the role of corrupting influence in current and proposed federal policy?
Well, let me take Luke off the hook for a minute, at any rate. I'm sure he wants to answer that question. Look, this is political economy. There's no doubt about it. And the object of political economy is to influence policy. And political economy was the original concept of economics, and I talk about that in my book, why that's what we practice. So I'm not surprised that the capitalists try and defend themselves by bringing forth arguments we think bogus, that they're a big lie. The fact, the claim that you can only do it with nuclear is a big lie, but that's part of the process. And our hope is, of course, that vetting the solutions will eventually lead to the right answer, and that will not be to subsidize nukes. Now Luke can talk about the politics.
Yeah, I get down into the mud. Just to the specific question, and I'm happy to send this as a follow-up. I think that the easiest answer here is to just, we say it a lot, follow the money. If you look at the proponents of this proposal, you find some of the nuclear industry's favorite members of Congress. I think that as a matter of as a point of fact, we ran the numbers on this a couple of weeks ago, but when the Cardin bill was first introduced as an amendment to the Wyden bill and then withdrawn, the original sponsors, Senator Cardin, Senator Casey, it's not a peerless work of research to identify the amount of money that both of these members are receiving from Exelon. I think that you can draw your own conclusions from that.
Yeah, and I'll just add both some historical perspective and some current perspective to this. To speak to current energy policy, which is the policy we're currently living under. The last major energy legislation that the U.S. government passed was the 2005 Energy Policy Act, which those of us who are unfortunately old enough to remember, was surrounded by allegations of corruption, principally through the lens of the White House meeting records, which included a bevy of energy industry and corporate lobbyists. But not a single representative of environmental interests. And so that energy policy produced a number of things that have been really devastating over the last 16 years. One of them, the fracking industry, which has been extremely controversial and leading to the vast expansion of natural gas infrastructure and the methane emissions that are also becoming a major contributor to climate change. It also made a case for a nuclear renaissance in the U.S. and massive federal investments in building new nuclear power plants on the notion that the nuclear industry had fixed its past problems and was ready to roll out a generation of new reactors that would be more economical and safer and faster to produce than the devastating history of what happened with the first generation of reactors that are currently operating. And Dr. Cooper, analyzed very well the path, the economic path that proposal took, which resulted in 30 applications for 30 new reactors around the country, which created a lot of fanfare. But 201, those projects, 28 of them have been canceled because they became too uneconomical. Two of the largest nuclear corporations in the world were bankrupted, over that period. And the only 2 reactors of those 30 that are under construction are now $15 billion over budget, more than 5 years delayed, and are costing Georgia ratepayers millions of dollars on their electricity bills without ever having generated a single kilowatt hour of electricity. So there, I think we see, whereas the 2005 energy law did not provide the kind of incentives to renewable energy and really hindered the start of the trend that the Dr. Cooper documents. I think when you look at the current proposals today, what's very clear from both the Cardin and Manchin nuclear subsidy proposals is that there's two companies that will be the principal benefits of this subsidy. That's the First Energy, a company that owns the reactors that First Energy Corporation spun off as a result of a bankruptcy 2 years ago, and the Exelon Corporation, which has just recently failed to receive a new subsidy for its nuclear power plants in Illinois. Both of these companies have been, as Dave Kraft mentioned, involved in federal corruption cases around the subsidies that they lobbied for at the state level. So there's, if you want to, it's very clear that who's going to benefit from this subsidy, is connected to, some potentially corrupt activities at the state level.
And I think I'll add just a couple of points from Illinois' perspective. I would want to point out that although we are quite grateful for the FBI's involvement here in Illinois and for the cascading events that resulted in the speaker resigning and the corruption charges against Exelon, we honestly don't know what the original motivation of the FBI was to begin these investigations. I think that's something to keep in mind, that none of us has that crystal ball, but it is something that only they know, and I guess we'll find out at a later date. But the second comment I wanted to make is one of the things we ought to be thinking about are ways to take avenues for potential corruption out of the mix. And for example, in Illinois, the Clean Energy Jobs Act, which did not get passed, had extensive clauses which called for just transitions for plant workers, protecting local tax bases, so that the crisis that is inevitable would at least be softened. And if you remove that crisis opportunity, which we dubbed the nuclear hostage crisis earlier, then you're knocking out the avenues for potential corruption later on. Our point of view has always been it's the workers and the communities that need the bailing out, not the profitable corporations. So the more that we address that in future legislation, perhaps even at the federal level, you're going to reduce the avenues and opportunities for corruption to proceed.
Yeah, and I would just I just want to conclude here. I can't say it better than my fellow panelists already have said, but I think that you don't need a crystal ball in order to see that with regard to these investigations, other shoes are likely to drop. No member of Congress should feel comfortable pointing a giant money cannon at this industry, not knowing what is coming down the pike. It's a risk for everyone. It's an absolute risk for any member of Congress to be standing next to these companies and advocating for them to receive billions in tax dollars.
Doesn't look like we have any additional questions at this time. I just wanted to make sure that reporters on the line have a chance to pose their questions. Again, if you wish to ask a question, you can use the raise your hand function, or you can use the Q&A box below. As a reminder, the Q&A period is for reporters only. And if you're, like I said, if you're having any issues with your audio or the raise your hand function, you can use the text-based Q&A box. It does not look like we have any additional questions at this time, so I just wanted to turn it back over to Tim Judson of NEARS for some closing thoughts today.
Sure, thank you, Alex. And so thanks again to everybody for joining this press conference today, and to release Dr. Cooper's report. And I just want to conclude with some positive observations regarding the report. It finds that the best investment for climate, jobs, and the economy is in a transition to a renewable, modern energy system, phasing out nuclear power with fossil fuels. Focusing on the transition to 100% renewable energy will feed a virtuous cycle of job creation, climate protection, technological innovation, and cost reductions. The report shows that subsidizing nuclear power will compromise President Biden's goals for the American Jobs Plan. Billions of dollars for old nuclear power plants will impede renewable energy and our most viable solutions to climate change. It will not create a single new job and prevent the creation of thousands more jobs in the renewable energy economy. And it will prolong racial and economic justice, subsidizing the production of radioactive waste while keeping energy costs high. The report demonstrates that we can create a just, equitable, thriving economy and solve the climate crisis by investing in renewable energy and modernizing our electric grid, which the American Jobs Plan promotes. But it can't do that if we keep bailing out the nuclear energy industry. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. We just want to make sure you know where to get more information following today's news conference. To connect with any of the speakers that you've heard from today, to get more information, you can contact Alex Frank, that's myself, at 703-276-3264. A recording of this news event will be made available later today online at the Friends of the Earth website. That's foe.org. You can also find the news release and link to the report there as well. I just want to thank everyone for joining this news event today. It was hosted by Friends of the Earth and the Nuclear Information and Resource Service.